Hello, listener, and welcome to the Locker Room podcast by Deely Sports Science. I'm Ciaran Deely, and I have Head of Performance Ross Bennett here with me today. We're going to speak about, this is the 54th episode. It's been a while since I've been on, Ross, so it's good to be back. I know you were on with a couple of the professional football coaches. Michael Beale, a little while back, he's been doing pretty well with Aston Villa.
Yeah, he's flying, kids. So, I've always rated him, but it's fantastic to see him doing well in Premier League now. So, yeah, I haven't been on for a while either. I think Joe and Stevie Poocher are flying the flag, and a couple of others are beating us to it. So it's good to get back.
Good. Okay, today what we're going to be speaking about is designing a season training plan. We're going to look specifically at the club GA season because that's starting up now very soon in the coming months. And we've a season-long planner for 2022 season up on the website deelysportscience.com, where you can purchase, and members get it for 20 quid, non-members for 40 quid. But also we will dip into to speak about professional football, soccer and other sports and stuff like that. Everything can be applied to any sport. Just firstly then, I just want to thank our sponsors, Ripped.app. Ripped is a software platform built for performance coaches and organizations with easy-to-use programming tools and training load, well-being and nutritional monitoring via the Ripped app. All your coaching tools are in one place, streamlining your coaching, making it more accessible for your clients and athletes, and providing you with the insights you need to optimize performance. To find out more, head over to www.ripped.app, that's RYPT.app, and use the code LOCKERROOM, all one word, capitals, to get your 2 months free trial through DSS. Alternatively, go to deelysportscience.com, go to the podcast page, and you can click through a link there, and it gets you 2 months free for anybody to use Ripped for your gym and monitoring tools. Okay, great. Ross, I was looking through the planner that you designed last night, quite an extensive planner. This season is a little bit different, just focusing on the GA season. Again, this is the first split season. So in other words, teams will be returning back to pre-season in springtime. They should have league games then coming up. We don't know, every single county is different. So we think something like in March and April will be the return of league and cup games, going all the way through April, May, June, and probably while the intercounty season goes on, probably then when the intercounty season finishes sometime in July, or obviously for other counties, it'll finish before that if teams get knocked out. But let's just say July. Championship then, club championship for GA teams will start in July, August, September, and potentially finishing in October, and then into provincial championship games. I know it can be complicated, but in other words, what we're looking at this year, there's a split season. First half of the season, intercounty will be going on. Second half of the season will be club. But of course, club will still continue on for the first half of the season as well. So it's a little bit different this year. Previously, we would have been looking for teams to peak for championship games, let's say in April. They'd have a couple of games in April. Then they'd have a bit of a break. And then you'd be looking to peak later on in the summer, in August, September, into the autumn, into October and all. So a little bit different this year. In some ways, actually, there are challenges, but in some ways it's quite clean and clear how to approach the season then, isn't it?
Yeah, like you said there, it's going to be linear development all the way throughout the season, really. You should see your team get stronger and stronger, fitter, and also technically and tactically better, especially if you've gone in with a new club. But also you have to remember the workload that they've done the last season, where things were scuppered because of COVID, and then things got crammed in quite an intense period of time. So we've taken that into account in our approach in terms of coming back a little bit later. It's quite a clean format. I mean, it's quite a nice format from an outsider looking in. I know culturally it's different, but I quite like the split season on paper anyway.
Yeah, me too, actually. I think it's much cleaner. There's more certainty there for teams and coaches and players, club players, that, okay, this is how the season will unfold. It might be a little bit frustrating in that between, let's say, February up to June, July, you won't have your intercounty players at all, and then it's straight into championship. But in other words, you know when championship will be on, you know when you have to peak for it. It'll be quite maybe a slow start to the season, and in ways that's why our recommendation was that wait till at least February to return. So I know that it's easy for teams to start back as early as possible in January, 1st of January, or even pre-Christmas. We're trying to, not recommend that and push them back to at least February, well into February in some ways. But let's just say from 1st of February, where you start back at that stage into your kind of early season work.
Yeah, but we've got down here the recommendation first of Feb to get them back in from week commencing 1st Feb, which is obviously this week. That still gives you, depending on the first league game, of course, going to differ county to county. It still gives you around 5 to 6 weeks to prepare. Now, if you think of other sports and the sports that we've worked in as well, football, that's a typical pre-season time. So I think it's definitely enough time to get people up and running for the first league game, but knowing that you're not going to be at your absolute peak for that first league game, because if you prepare for too long before that league game, the worry is that at some point during the season, when it really matters, championship, I know league's important as well, but towards the mid and the end, you don't want to burn out and really affect yourself there.
Yeah, so it's a bit different in soccer, isn't it? Because you've got a a 7 or 8 month long season. You've got probably 6 weeks of preseason, maybe 7 weeks. Some teams, they'll prepare, they'll work hard in that. It'll be progressive throughout those 6 to 7 weeks. And then you're straight into a league format whereby the first game will be worth the same amount of points as the very, very last game, in the beginning of May. It's very easy to approach that, and it's very simple. You know what you have to do. Obviously, in football, in soccer, certain teams will look to peak at the end of the season. So like your Man Cities, your Chelseas, etc., who are looking to, be at the latter stages of Champions League and stuff like that. They're hoping that they're going to be at their strongest at the end of the season. But this is a little bit different than in the GA, isn't it? Because you're using those league and cup games at the beginning of the season still really for developmental purposes.
Sure, I 100% agree with you, but I don't think in any sport you can maintain your performance right through from the start of the season to the end. So I think even in the top sports like soccer, the teams won't be peaked at the start of the season, even though everybody will expect them to be. But I think also the culture around all of the players now in any sport is completely different. The off-season isn't a time where people go on 4-week benders and don't touch a ball anymore, don't do any physical activity. People come back to pre-season in all sports relatively in half good shape. So due to off-season programs, due to more awareness and the game changing all round, that's in all sports. So you don't actually need as long now to shock those bodies back into a physical condition to compete. They're already coming in at quite a good base level in the main. So yeah, I do. It is definitely different, and I think that the GA club should use them first 2 months of the league and cup campaign to really still keep developing and gearing towards the summer. But I think that happens in other sports without people realizing it as much.
Yeah, kind of naturally. I think it's a good point you make as well, that because of COVID, the GA season has been a little bit all over the place for the last 2 years. And a lot of teams have just finished up, like very recently, their club season, because the season got completely condensed in 2021. So actually a bit of rest and recovery is a really good thing. And as you say, players now are kind of 24/7 athletes in some ways. Of a lot of top players they're either students, they're working as teachers, they're working in a bank or something like that, where they have relatively good working hours and they've time to go to the gym and do their recovery and eat well. And so yeah, I'm not saying all club players are like that. You still have the Joe Coulters of the world putting on the jersey and stuff, but we try at least.
Well, I think there'll be a few teachers angry with you there, saying they've got enough time to go and train.
Listen, some of my brothers are teachers, so I'll take the heat.
I think you was right there about the like making sure we respect the condensed season, because we went from a massive period of individual programs to loads and loads of sport, where probably we saw quite a high incidence of different injuries of growth related of load related injuries. So I think that now we just have to make sure we've respected that the body's gone through that different type of season, and that's why we pitch things a little bit later to give them a bit more time to a bit of downtime before they come into competitive sport again.
Do you think we're still in that phase where, remember last year and the year before, when the season returned briefly during after COVID lockdowns, where we recommended get into as much games and kind of collaborative practices as much as possible in training, because the players had done so much individual skills work on their own, against a wall in the park and stuff like that, or maybe in pairs if they could, depending on their bubble. And we were recommending, get back into those kind of, big group practices, phases of play, possession based, transfer, everything like that. I mean, I know that's massively in our programs anyway, obviously, but do you think there are still players who are still lacking in that aspect of it more than the skills after the last 2 years?
I think so. I think that some players will probably be affected by that for the rest of their career. Like if they came through essential development blocks, if you think of like young kids, 16 to 18, up to 19, who are breaking into senior football or football where the format's changed in soccer or things like that, they've missed that chunk of development. So I think they'll be behind for a few years. I think physically now, depending on what your stance was as a club, I think now physically due to COVID, we've come out the back of that risk period, but only just. I think there's been circuit breakers over here over the Christmas period, which has set us back a little bit. So I think only just now we're coming out the back end of that from a physical perspective. But I think there'll be players who are younger players tactically who might take 5-6 years to really catch up, and that's where your coaching has to accelerate that understanding.
Yeah, and linked with that point, I think without encouraging people to head out on too many social nights or whatever it is, but if you think of it, there's a lot of, especially younger players, like you mentioned, who've been introduced into teams and probably don't know the other players that well, or maybe don't know the coaches that well. And so I think the importance of that kind of the psychosocial corner, that we always speak about, that gets ignored sometimes or by some teams or clubs, is going to be really important.
Yeah, totally agree. And even the ability to just socially interact in society. Some people probably have lost skill sets there. Figuring that out amongst your squad can be quite nice. And things like the player councils and player leadership groups and different bonding activities, which I'm not really it's not on the forefront of my mind when you're coaching. But I think in this situation, you have to see what you've got in front of you as a group and what's gonna get you better.
Yeah, definitely. Just out of interest, just from your own experience working in professional soccer, the players who either had COVID, well, especially the ones who had COVID, or even the players who, let's say, were in a period of isolation for 5 to 7 weeks, any particular issues that you kind of came across with that, or as a general kind of rule of thumb, is it just approach it like a kind of an injury period where you progressively reintroduce them back into training slowly, or how did you feel things went?
Yeah, interesting, because we actually underestimated the effects of COVID at the start, especially those that had COVID but wasn't symptomatic. We kind of got them back into training fairly quickly, but actually there was still some residual effects from a cardiovascular perspective that we didn't think of, and they were struggling quite a bit. So we've designed we work from the sports science perspective in the development side of things, so we have to be careful with kids, but we're very pragmatic in our approach in giving them at least like 4 modified sessions before they go back into the full training session, and making sure you're checking their obs and their response to training and how they're finding training during it, their heart rate, their temperature, things like that you can check very easily. But yeah, I think be very careful for someone that's had COVID, especially someone who's been symptomatic, because coming back into exercise, a lot of the symptoms around fatigue have still been there a week to 2 weeks later.
Yeah, no, it's really good advice. I want to then look at the program. So the program that you designed from a physical point of view then. So what's your general approach, let's say, without digging down into too much detail? As the season approaches, let's say they're still in off season, they might be doing a little bit of cross training as regards, they might be playing a bit of squash or 5-a-side soccer or whatever it is, which is great, just keeping them in shape, doing a few little runs or, whatever they want for fun. So let's say then we're beginning or the first week of February back into training then. What's your approach as regards the physical aspect?
Sure. Well, you know my stance in terms of I'm an advocate of longer running, for example, well, I say longer running, 6 to 8 minute runs and stuff like that. And we've put that in the first week. Now, typically on a pre-season, we'd have a few weeks of that to get the boys back into shape and give them some lower intensity, high volume work. I've been interacting with Gareth Sanford quite a bit on Twitter, who works in athletics. Now, I'm not in the majority in the sporting world. You know, people think everything needs, you know, and no one's right or wrong. This is just my approach. People think things should be more related to the game and more specific to the sport. Now, I think most of the time that's true. 90% of our training is specific to the sport and overloading those physical capacities. But I do think we limit our athletes' ability to endure those lower intensity, higher volume stuff, which is going to have a good impact physiologically without getting too deep. For their performance, so like the peripheral adaptations, the extraction from the blood to the muscle, stuff like that, that you won't be looking at to target and overload with the high intensity work. So we've got the first week of that in, plus the introduction to technical work, and obviously basic load in integration, not working them too hard in the first week, feeling the ball, a little bit of physical work. And I just think leave the players wanting a bit more, where they've been pushed, but they haven't been pushed too much. They're not out on their feet and on their backs with their hands around the head and stuff like that. So that's what week one would look like. But that longer type running quickly goes, because we've condensed the preseason shorter. So we get into some VO2 max in week 2, then we get into aerobic power work, and then by end of week 3, the longer running is kind of gone, and you go into more mass type work. But I think that the main thing is that, like we've always said before, yes, you have that physical component of fitness, but get straight back into the technical work, get straight back into your game plan work, but just be very, very methodical about how you approach that and step that up over time, over the first 6 weeks.
Yeah, I mean, it's physiologically specific, isn't it? It doesn't have to be exactly sport and skill specific in absolutely everything you do. You know, just like you break down a movement or break down a skill into its component parts, you overload that aspect, you reintroduce everything back together then into the game or whatever it is, and and you should see greater improvement. So that makes complete, you know, scientific sense to me, as well as kind of practical sense, I think.
Sure, like we're all working off the game, and like a lot of our you know, debates I've had with people over the past is like, well, look at the game. It's like, well, we're all working backwards from the game. The game is a high intensity game. It's repeated sprints essentially. There's periods of massive high outputs and there's periods of low outputs where essentially you have to recover. Now, if you break down all of those subcomponents, the aerobic fitness is a large component of that, as well as maximal sprint speed and speed endurance, and etc. So if you break down aerobic endurance as well, the lower intensity stuff is going to give you them peripheral adaptations to recover in between bouts of high intensity stuff. So we're working on that little component when we start off working with those. Now, once we shift towards more repeated sprint, lactate stacking, we call them the rodeos that we took from QPR, which are basically overloading sport specific movements, then you're hoping that your aerobic base that you took through the continuum now enables you to perform those high intensity exercises better and recovering more in between. So we're always working from the game, and it's one part of the development. It's not the whole thing, but for me, it definitely has a place.
Yeah, definitely. The nice thing with that, I think, as well, is that you can dip those, let's say, 4x4 minute runs, VO2 max, developmental conditioning protocols back in at any point of the season as well. I think players will benefit, you know, in the height of the summer, at all stages, as long as it fits into the schedule and the program and the games program. I think you can get massive benefits from that.
Sure. I think the easiest way to do it is to look at, like, you're always going to have a fixture-free weekend within an 8-week period. I was just dropping your high volume stuff there and your low intensity stuff there. So everything else is high intensity, working towards the game. It looks like the sport. You're looking at your loading, you're looking at different things, and then you give them a little dose every 6 to 8 weeks of your 4x4 minute runs. And for me, that will just give them enough variation and stuff to physically, you know, keep progressing and stay at that level.
Yeah, I think, and the last point just to make on that as well is that, like, because of the normal technical and tactical training, there will be loads of high intensity work with change of direction and agility and eccentric, you know, work on the quads and turning and decelerations and everything. So, you know, in ways you don't have to kind of overload that with additional conditioning at times as well, because there's so much in the training session. So it's nice to get that bit of kind of physiological variety to your players and athletes as well. The gym program, just very briefly, is quite simple, isn't it? Because you've got, as you say, you've a start point to the season, you've an end point to the season, you have to develop all throughout the season, hopefully peak in that kind of those summer months and into the autumn. So it follows quite a linear progressive model.
Yeah, it's fairly simple. Like during preseason, typically we'd always go with a fairly like linear, like periodized plan. Start with some higher reps type stuff, more from a movement pattern perspective, and just get them back into their movements. You want them to be competent in the gym. Shift that slightly towards what we call functional hypertrophy, where you're doing 6 to 8 reps. But I think people get scared and think, well, I don't want my team to get like too big. Well, in actual fact, like the 6 to 8 reps you're doing once or twice a week is not really going to come anywhere close to volume to enable them to really get hypertrophy. It's called functional hypertrophy due to some adaptations that happen at a muscular level. Without getting too boring, I know you're quite on clued in, Kears, but like sarcomeres, increasing that sarcomeres in series and stuff like that. So that's the only reason. And I think people have to realize to get stronger, you just need to overload some parameter, and by actually overloading intensity to lift to 6 to 8 reps, you're going to provide that increase in force production to get stronger. Yeah. And then it shifts on to more the traditional strength stuff where you're going to 5 reps, and then that just progresses through to power, and it kind of cycles through the season in terms of strength and power stuff. Now, what I would say, this is very generic because we don't know the players here, the individual players that are in your team. So if there are individual players that have specific ILPs that need to work on, or individual plans that need to be more explosive and powerful, then you might not get them to follow the periodized plan as much. They might be on an individual program, or you might have all the players individualized within the theme. So even though you're working on strength, there might be certain areas that a player might need to work on, or they might need to dip a few more plyometrics in there because that's where they need the most development. So this is just a blueprint that if you had very limited resource and you just wanted to give your team a plan, then I think it's very, very competent and it ticks all the boxes. But obviously, you know your players better, and everybody works with different players.
Yeah, exactly. And even there'll be a lot of younger players, you'll hear coaches saying that, he needs or she needs to, usually he needs to bulk up, so let's give him a hypertrophy program throughout the whole season. But obviously that's not the correct thing to do. But there are different points in the season that player can do an extra little bit of gym work, or they can do an extra session, let's say per week as well, as long as it fits into the program correctly. Just looking at then, so it's quite easy program to follow, the one that we've designed. There's different, it's editable as well on Excel, so you can put in your fitness testing. Tell us the importance of fitness testing throughout the season, and not just doing it at the beginning of the season and never coming back to it then. And how do you, say, for instance, in the academy, how would you use it?
Yeah, it's a good point, because again, there's very mixed views on this, and people say, well, why test? Why? What's the point of testing? You're taking up training time, etc. For me, it's paramount, and it's actually very easy to do. You don't take up much time at all. In the program, you've obviously got it on week 1, where you go for a full battery of tests. I understand in terms of like gym testing, because you're going to get quite good feedback from the weights they're lifting week to week. So essentially, you have an idea of what they're getting stronger at. But the simple thing for me, like your jump stuff that you should do, and also your aerobic stuff that we do. I mean, we do a 4-lap fitness test here, either in our dome facility, which is just under 1.2k, or on the pitches, which is just over 1.3k. So what we would do here, I mean, we have to comply with what's called the EPPP in the academy stuff here, where we have to have testing 3 times a year, 3 times a season. We have to do that to get our funding. That's a rule that's put in place from the Premier League. But we do it every 6 weeks. So we have time points in between those testing points, that every 6 weeks we do a 4-lapper at the start of training on a tough training session. So they do a warm-up, they go into the 4-lapper, and then they just train as normal. So it's normalized within the culture. And it's important to do that because you're constantly checking the individual status of your player. You have an idea of the amount of load they're going through and the program they're going through, because you've written it for your club or your county or whoever it is. But how are they responding to that? Are they becoming fitter, or Are they losing fitness, or is it a fatigue issue? It starts to bring up some questions that you might not see from just watching them in the game. So I think it's really, really important to do. Even top clubs probably only test once at the start and they don't touch it again. But then, for me, if the manager comes to you and says, well, how fit is he? Where's your reference point? You can look at all the loading all you like, or you can look at how good he's performing in training, which will give you indication and the match, but it will only give you so much. So I think it's important to check the individual fitness abilities of your players. And that's not just aerobically, we do power testing, very, very easy to do. You can do it during the gym sessions. How's your training program pairing up to the response? Are you getting those adaptations that you want? Is the player developing? And that's what you need to see over the season. If they're not, then you need to ask questions. Is it too much? Is it fatigue? Is it not enough? Is there enough variation there? Have I put the foundation blocks, etc., etc.?
I saw somebody describe it. I like it. It was called a training prescription tool. So instead of just using it to kind of look back at your training, you're also using it to prescribe future training. And in terms of like the mass test that you said about the 4-lapper, you can do it. You can design your mass protocol from that. The other thing as well is that, like, as you say, it can be integrated in as part of your training session. And I think if you do a 4-lapper at the beginning of the session, of course you can go on then and just train as normal. There's loads of times to do jumps if you want to do squat jump, counter movement jump, single leg counter movement jump, some sort of RSI, reactive strength index test. You can do that before training. The players are arriving an hour and a half before training. You can definitely do it when they're in a fresh state. So maybe, I suppose, sprints is probably the only thing that you need to just, schedule it carefully into, the beginning of your session, or as a standalone kind of speed session, maybe on another night. And as you say, it can be easily put in as part of the gym program as well, to do your monitoring. And I think it is very important, because if you're throughout the season, if that player, if their results are down, it means something. It's either maybe the training program is not intense enough. It could be the training program is too intense and the loading is too much. The player might have some, injury or niggle or something like that. They might be suffering from overtraining or some fatigue. There could be an illness. And that's all really good objective information that you can get. And it's more, of course, you still just have the subjective conversations with those players, but if it's backed up with objective stats and measures like that, I think it can really add weight to a discussion.
Yeah, defo. And I like the thing there about the training tool prescription. Like, for those that are very fortunate enough to work with GPS, and there'll be some county, I'm sure county people listening as well. Well, we use relative, thresholds for high-speed running, very high-speed running, sprint distance, which is a separate topic in itself. But for me, it has to be individualized. So it has to be relative. And we've gone down the road now here, which we utilize both off maximal sprint speed and maximal aerobic speed. So if you get constantly updated measures, true measures of these things, then the thresholds that you're using are going to be more accurate. So they're used to individualized thresholds. And I think as well, if you're using GPS, you can do sprint speed within your speed sessions. If you're getting meters per second, you're seeing when someone's hit a new max speed, and that's then informing your relative training zones and how the player's developing as well. So good point on the speed stuff. If you're going to do like gait testing, just make sure it's in the right time in terms of the periodized plan, and they're fully recovered, and maybe it's not the first session back on the pitch in the week and stuff like that. Yeah, exactly. Okay, cool. We'll just move on to the technical and tactical. I mean, first point to make is, at the beginning of the season, the days of kind of killing your players in pre-season and not seeing a ball for 6 weeks and everything, that's long gone. And I think even down to like lower level clubs, that's gone as well now. So really, the balls are out at the very beginning of the session, right from day one. Yeah, 100%. I mean, you think about it, kids, even when we went into London years ago, we still had that one physical session on the Wednesday night. Now, I know you wasn't here. You was in India, so maybe that was why. But even the culture shift from that perspective now, the last 3 or 4 years, straight back on the balls. There's no just physical only session. And you've got to think about, like, you got 6 weeks, 5-6 weeks. yes, the physical side is important, but they need to get straight back into the work, the shape work, the lower level stuff that you can do in the first 2 weeks that aren't going to kill them physically, but are going to really instill the technical base, the principles of play, the tactical understanding, to prepare them for the start of the league.
Yeah, I think an interesting question came up on the DSS members WhatsApp group there during the week, and they were saying about the 1v1, the 2v2, the 2v1 is so important, you know, for work, skills work and everything like that, and taking on your man, and how it's a good practice and good drill to do, and that all teams should be doing that, you know, from the beginning of the season. And my advice was that they are brilliant, and we use them a lot in professional football and Gaelic football and every sport, hurling and everything. But obviously you have to program it carefully as well. And like a good rule of thumb is that you're not looking to put the absolute highest intensity work in the preseason or at the beginning of preseason. You need to build up to that. So maybe start off with your, you know, 5v5 work, 4v4 work, stuff like that, some sort of possession drill, and then work your way towards the end of preseason where you get to the 1v1 and 2v2 work.
Sure. Well, I think it depends on what context you want to use it in. So, like in terms of the game structure, you're actually better off going larger games, 10v10s, 11v, right off the start. So whatever numbers you've got and the largest, you know, amount of players you can fit in, if you could do a 15v15 even after two sessions, go into that, because people think, well, that's physically more demanding. Well, it is demanding, but you can cut the time, but also it's more about their aerobic capacity to get around the arena, and the amount of actions they do are going to be a lot lower. Now, as soon as you make that pitch smaller and make there less bodies on there, your medium-sized games, it becomes a high intensity game. Not so much in terms of the amount of high speed running you're going to cover or the amount of locomotive distance you're going to cover, but in terms of the contacts and 1v1s and when you're going to be called in and out of possession to have to affect play. Now, obviously, then if you go to 1v1 and 2v2s, that's happening all the time. There's no rest. So it depends on when you want to put it. From a games point of view, I would always put that in probably week 3, week 4 of a 6-week preseason. From a principle perspective, if you wanted to do some 1v1s from a possession, then again, it's like week 3, but always start with larger type stuff, even possessions, and shuffle yourself towards the 1v1s, 2v2s as you 3-4 weeks as you go along.
Yeah, and remember, you can limit the duration of any drill or practice as well for the actions, and give them more recovery and stuff like that. And maybe less reps than you will work your way up towards. Just thinking about slightly later at the beginning of the season, we kind of focus more on principles of play, possessions and stuff like that, and build up towards those more kind of the games program, and also within the training sessions, and also the phases of play. You're hardly going to go in like week 1 or week 2 straight into a phase of play. You're kind of building your way up to that a little bit as well, just from a kind of tactical point of view as well as technical and physical.
Yeah, I think it's a case of, especially if you've got a new team or you're going to play a different way, or you've got a whole new bunch of players, I think it's a case of, right, what does my end game plan look like? How do I want this team to play? What principles then fit into that game plan? So, you know, if we're a team that switch play well, then you might start to look at your midfield type players, your pivot type players being able to switch play effectively, and how you're going to do that. So that's why those little principle play type possessions and functions that we call them are going to be really important before you put it into the phase of play. Because if you go straight into the phase and say, right, I want you to do X, Y, and Z, but you haven't actually worked on the individual components of that, then I think you're setting them up to fail a little bit. Nothing wrong with going into a phase after 2-3 weeks at all. And again, it's just a guideline. It's all based on what your club need and what your team need. But to me, it makes sense to really hone in on 3 or 4 key principles, whether it's out of possession, in possession, before you put it into something that looks like the game.
Yeah, exactly. So in other words, you're practicing compactness and supporting the first defender and stuff like that in little drills or practices or possessions, whatever you want to call them. Before then, you expect to see them in the phase of play and in the, let's say, the large sided game or something.
Exactly. Like I've just done a webinar on playing the high press, right? So if your team, now it was all based on the soccer pitch, but as we said, we took a lot of that stuff into the county that we work for. But if you want to play a high press, then a major thing is going to be, first of all, the trigger of the first pass, but also getting pressure on the ball. So you're going to want to get pressure high up the pitch. So then your principal practice might be a possession that enables the first pass to be the trigger, and then it's about timing of movement and getting pressure on, making play predictable. Now, that then is your direct transfer into your phase. So you're talking about general principles of mentality, of going to the ball, supporting first defender, positioning of movement, timing of movement on a smaller scale where you're going to get more success and more turnovers. And then you take it into a phase of play where actually this is how it looks like over bigger distances, relation to your players left and right of you in your units, and you're scaffolding the principle to go into there. And then that you have the in possession stuff as well. So it's just about making sure the team are fully aware of the principles, and it's more about mindset without the possession stuff. It's about making sure that they know if they're nearest man, they've got to get to the ball. Whereas if you're playing a low block, it's like, okay, you might not go to the ball here. You might just scan and look at your position and stop them playing through you and block passing lanes. So it's just giving them ideas before you say, okay, now you've got to go and do it.
Yeah, exactly. That's the essence of coaching, isn't it? That you're working on that on the training pitch week in, week out before you expect to actually see it come to fruition on match day on Saturday or Sunday. You can't expect to just see it naturally occur, or even by you having a big speech before the game and telling them what you want. Have you done it on the pitch, on Tuesday night and on Friday night beforehand?
Yeah, 100%. And it's about actions as well. Like you go into a phase of play, yourself when you coach the phase, like how many times naturally are you going to get that option to press high in a phase of play over 30 minutes, maybe 8 to 10 times, or maybe 15 if you're working on kick out specifically, right? If you go into a possession or principle of a function or whatever you want to set it up, in 20 minutes, you could have a player doing 60 opportunities to go and press the ball, 50 opportunities to support the first defender, and 40 opportunities where he's in a team function or team shape. So the amount of actions they're getting to change a mindset and a way that you want them to play is much higher than they're going to get in the phase of play or the game.
Yeah, exactly. Just lastly then, I want to touch on in-season microcycle. So a week-long, let's say, program in season. Just because I think it's interesting, because we delve deep into it in the training program that's up on the website on deelysportscience.com. But if you're going to be training on, let's say in Gaelic football on a Tuesday night, a Friday night, and then you either have a match on the Sunday, or you might train on a Sunday, like a very simple way of kind of viewing it is that maybe you might do small-sided game, high intense accels, decels, defensive work maybe focused on the Tuesday night. On the Thursday or Friday night, you might kind of play a little bit more expansively, phase of play, focus on the attacking and everything like that. And obviously at the weekend, whether it's a training session or a match, it's going to be large-sided 15v15 or 11v11. And then it's kind of just, producing the performance on the weekend. And any thoughts about the microcycle from I suppose firstly a physical side, but also a tactical side as well?
Sure, yeah. I mean, to touch on the physical stuff first, so I think like the Tuesday, for example, if you went Tuesday, Friday, Sunday, like, in 2 days a week, 2 training days a week, we know that you can't just have a session where you're not really training. We have the luxury of the full-time players where you can do a light session on a match day +2. Now, on a match day +2 in the Gaelic, we know that's probably going to be the session you're going to get after players a little bit. And because you're going to want it slightly further away from the game. So on the Friday night, you're not going to want them to work too hard. So Tuesday is going to be your time to get after players. But what I would say is make sure you have some form of monitoring process, even if it's subjective, where players have worked extremely hard at the weekend, and you're checking in on them when they arrive. Even if you've got no sports science support, as a coach, just check in with players. You can set up simple questionnaires for them to submit, or you can just make sure you get around and talk to each player, check in with your medical team, and just make sure that Tuesday's right for each individual. But if they've recovered well, then we're going to get after them. I think with the game stuff that you mentioned, like, I think it's too simplistic to say that Tuesday we're going to work them small-sided, and then Thursday we're going to prepare them for the game. I think you always have the Thursday or Friday session to prepare them for the game. That's your tactical session where you want to instill your game plan, make sure the messages are across. The Tuesday's a physical one, but for me, I think you cycle those games across the weeks. How many times do you have to do small-sided games, and how much transfer does it actually have to the big game? So I think 2 weeks out of the 6, you work small-sided games. 2 weeks out of the 6, you work medium-sized games, and 2 weeks out of the 6, you actually overload the large game itself. And I think that will give you an all-rounded kind of physical profile, but also, you know, understanding the game a bit better across the phase.
Yeah. You know, something I always liked when just, you know, with the London lads or other teams when I was involved with, I did like to kind of have that last session, whether it was a Thursday or Friday, really focusing on the attack, about, right, how are we going to break down the opposition, and setting up in training, obviously one set of teams set up like, you know, I don't know, like Galway or something like that this is how they're going to defensively set up, and then really focusing on our attacking side. Then here's how are we going to break this down? How are we going to break down a low block, a defensive unit or something? And the Tuesday night can be, you know, maybe it's working more on the defensive side of thing, you know, so you're working on both sides, or it could be on the attack as well. But I did like that last kind of session was really, right, here's how we're going to win the game. The Tuesday night was like, here's how we're going to get close, you know, coming into the last 10 minutes. Here's how we're going to actually break through that dam then on the last night. Okay, we'll leave it at there for today. Thanks to Ross for that really insightful chat, just looking at designing a season-long training program, more focus on the GA club season, but it can be easily adapted to the soccer world or basketball, rugby, or even intercounty world. Some really interesting insights there from a physical point of view, but also the technical and tactical aspects as well. So it's our 54th episode. I just want to thank again our sponsors, Ripped. So if you're tired of using limitations of using Excel and email to deliver programs, Ripped can help you simplify the creation and delivery of training programs, making it easier for you to provide everything your clients and athletes need, all at your fingertips, with training load, well-being, and nutritional monitoring, so you can get the full picture of your clients' and athletes' performance. Find out more, head over to www.ripped.app. And if you go to the DeelySportsScience.com website, go to the podcast page, you can click through the link there, and anybody listening to this podcast can get 2 months free access to Ripped. Okay, thanks very much, and we'll see you next week.